So, hi there everyone, good morning and welcome to another lecture of information security. I just noticed, oh no, everything's alright, I have the right slide deck. So today we want to talk more about cryptography and go into some depth on this topic. So this is the first of several blocks or lectures that we're going to have about cryptography. So let's have a brief orientation before we start. At least if the slide deck chooses to cooperate. Let's see. There we go. So last week we already had a tiny bit of an introduction. So in the first lecture we first talked about some general terminology that is related to information security, but we also talked a bit about different security notions and one very important principle in cryptography, namely Kerckhoffs's principle. The plan for this week is that we talk about authentication mechanisms, so mechanisms to guarantee the integrity of data. And we're going to see that there are different notions that correspond to this. We're going to look at two specific cryptographic schemes, namely hash functions on the one hand side without a key and message authentication codes, which have a key. And in the following weeks, we plan to have a look at another very important measure of or security property, namely confidentiality. So here we're going to have a look at encryption schemes and more specifically at authenticated encryption schemes, which are encryption with added integrity protection. And we're also going to have a look inside of the building blocks that are inside all of these schemes, namely the so-called primitives. And finally, we also want to have a look at how we can establish secure communication, how we can use hard problems from mathematics to do something like key exchange or other asymmetric primitives. And to make sure that we are all sort of equally prepared for today's lecture, let's have a short recap. So in the security information part, or in the information security part, we talked mainly about 4 to 5 central words that sort of describe the chain of things on the way from a product to an attack. Namely, the product that has some asset that we want to protect, and the asset is secure if it has some security properties. And for any asset, there are some things that could go wrong, so that could endanger these security properties. These are threats. And we said that the vulnerability is as soon as we have a concrete bug that could be exploited to instantiate such a threat. And when this actually happens, so when an adversary actually does something, we have an attack. And cryptography is then one of the building blocks that can help assure that this chain is broken in the sense that our security property does not end up in an attack. And we saw that cryptography is a general term for algorithms that transform data so it can be sent over an untrusted channel. And for this, we created a new asset. So we replaced the original asset, the data, with a new one, the key. And the key is the only thing in the whole thing that needs to be kept secret in order for the crypto system to be secure. And this is also what Kerckhoffs's principles say, namely that any algorithm we use to do this should be considered public, known to the adversary, and only the key should hold the secret. And what I suggest now is to get us all woken up a bit, that we transform this slide into a little quiz. So it would be time to get out your phones again, or start up a separate browser tab and head over to Menti. So unlike last week, what I want to do here is to have a quiz where you can actually collect points. You get slightly more points when you are faster, but the main thing is that you are correct. Somebody is requesting the cat. I'm sorry, the cat is not awake yet, I think. Let's have a brief look. No, she doesn't want to join. So let's wait another few seconds. Maybe a few of you can confirm if they've already ended up at Menti, so that I have some sort of feeling that we're going in the same direction. Okay, at least one person joined. Let's wait a tiny little more to also accommodate for the latency latency that we have. So let's go, people are writing. So let's have a look at the first question in a moment. I hope you've all been able to enter your nicknames or are currently able to do so. Oh yes, people are joining, that's nice. Let's wait a few more seconds and then let's go and start the quiz. So first up, who's the villain in any crypto system? So let's have a look. Almost everybody voted for Eve. That is actually correct. We also got a few votes for Victor, which is a bit looks like a good a good idea because of villain. We said that Eve is for eavesdropping or evil. Victor is actually somebody else who we will later meet in this lecture. Victor is short for verifier, so that's somebody who verifies authentication. Eve's the dropper, yeah. Okay, we also got some votes for Alice. I'm a bit appalled at that because, of course, Alice would never do any wrong. Let's have a look at the next question. So the question now is, which of these is not a classic security property? So I entered a relatively long time for you to choose your answers to accommodate for the latency. Please let me know in the chat if for future reference this should be shorter or longer. So what are the results we have here? Let me see. We have almost all votes on the correct answer, fidelity. So while fidelity is of course something desirable, it's not actually a classic security property. We also have quite a number of votes on availability. However, availability is actually one of the central CIA properties. So making sure that systems are always up and running is a very important security property actually. Okay, let's have a look at the next question. And that is, what does Kerckhoffs's principle actually say? So I already mentioned that in the beginning, actually. Oh, here we have a bit of a more varied opinion. Still, most of you guessed the right answer, which is that the algorithm should be considered public. So I also often summarize it as open source cryptography principle. The code or the implementation and the specification of the algorithm should be public. Quite a few of you voted for security by obscurity. This is actually the exact opposite of Kerckhoffs's principle. So security by obscurity is relying on not publishing your code in order for nobody to be able to find bugs. Whereas Kerckhoffs's principle is more the classic open source way. If you make it public, everybody can evaluate it, and thus everybody who is maybe not capable of evaluating it can still gain trust in it. The sound is a bit quiet if I turn to the screen. Yeah, I guessed that this would happen. This is unfortunately not something I can change, because if I turn the microphone up all the time, then you'll have quite a lot of Übersteuerungseffekte. So what I suggest is maybe I just don't talk while I walk to the screen. Anyways, let's head to question number 4 out of 6. This is now starting to be more about cryptography, namely, what can be safely transmitted even on an untrusted channel? So which of these values is sent? Okay, this one had a clearer answer again. So yes, it's indeed, in case of an encryption scheme, the ciphertext that we can safely transmit without any problems. There are quite a few votes on the other ones as well. I think those were the plain text. Of course, we shouldn't directly send the plain text. We also definitely should not send our secret key over the channel. So this answer would have been true if it would have been about the public key and public key cryptography, but not about the key in general. And finally, I think that reads a hash value. As we will see later this lecture, a hash value is usually not the thing you transmit over an untrusted channel, because there it can be manipulated and the hash does not protect against that. Okay, I think that leaves us to the next to last question. Namely, which key do Alice and Bob have in symmetric crypto? What sort of key? Oh, okay. There was not a lot of agreement on that one, but still the majority got the right answer. So yes, indeed, a shared secret key is what they have. So this is a key that they agree on together in the beginning, and then they share it, so they both know it, but it's still secret. So it's neither a public key nor a private key. Both of these are terms from asymmetric cryptography, where private as usually means private for one person. So just one person has the private key, whereas everyone has the public key. But we will revisit this terminology at a later point in case you're still a bit unsure about things. Okay, off to the last question. And that is, which attack scenario of the following is the weakest, meaning it gives fewest privileges for the attacker? Here we have a bit of a more agreement. So yes, indeed, a known ciphertext scenario where the attacker gets nothing except the ciphertext that is transmitted over the untrusted channel is indeed the weakest scenario. There are stronger scenarios which can still be realistic where an attacker learns a bit more. So for example, a known plaintext scenario where they gain information about some of the plaintext or parts of the plaintext and try to recover the rest. Or chosen plaintext where they can trick the user of the crypto system into sending particular messages, encrypting them, then gets to observe the ciphertext, and then from this wants to infer information about some later plaintext or about the key. Okay, so thanks everybody for participating. Let's have a look at the leaderboard. I see this was quite a tight race between many of you. So here indeed the timing decided the thing. And it appears like Muesli with 5,622 points is our winner. Congratulations. But also thanks everybody else for joining up. let's have a look back at the lecture and have a look at what we plan to do today. So we have first a bit of a general outline into what we want to talk about, what the goals are that we want to achieve in this lecture. That's pretty fun. I will have a short question at the end where you can vote which parts of this lecture you want to keep and which parts you maybe want to drop. So if you like the quiz, please vote for it at the end. So for today, we will look at two different types of schemes. Hash functions on the one hand, where we will have a look at what do they give us, so what's their security functionality and how are they defined. Then we will look at some generic attacks, meaning what can an attacker generally do depending on the sizes of the data that are involved. And finally, we will look at constructions, two constructions, how to build hash functions from primitives. And after that, so hash functions are an unkeyed primitive, meaning there is no key involved at all. Last week somebody said that hash functions are not cryptography. Well, they definitely are. And then we will look at message authentication codes, which are a bit like hash functions, but with a secret key. So it's like a keyed hash function where two people both have a shared secret key. Again, we will look at the security properties that they achieve and at two constructions. And finally, at the end, we will have a look at some protocols that employ these schemes in order to achieve entity authentication. So whereas the first two are about message authentication, so making sure a particular message is authentic and integrity protected, here this is going to be about entity authentication. I'm going to define the difference in a moment. To be short, it's about people, not data. So let's start with a general introduction about cryptographic authentication. There are two main types of properties, of security properties that we mean, or of functionalities that we mean by authentication. First, message authentication, where we try to protect on the one hand the authenticity of a message, meaning we want to verify what is the source of the message. And second, we want to verify the integrity, meaning that the message has not been modified while being transmitted. So it's all about protecting the data, whereas entity authentication is about protecting the user in the sense of verifying the identity of a communication endpoint. So who is this device that is trying to talk to me? Who is this user who is trying to talk to me? And this identity is usually defined as possession of some secret value. For example, a password. So knowing the password is equivalent to being a particular person in the cryptographic sense. So there have been a few questions here in the chat in the meantime. First, will it be available after the stream? So you will definitely be able to watch the quiz again after the stream. I don't think that Menti allows publishing the quiz in order to test yourself afterwards. I will have to look into that, whether that's possible. It's actually a pretty good idea. There is another point here. Wäre es möglich, die Folien kurz bevor die Vorlesung beginnt hochzuladen? Absolutely. I thought I did that. Maybe I forgot. Okay, I'll have a look at that in the break. I'm sorry I can't do it right now because it takes a few steps. But usually I upload it the evening before. Maybe I forgot this time. I will also have to say at this point that you will see that the slides I upload are a bit more extensive than here. So here there are a few slides where we only have a picture or so. And this is in order for me not to be hidden behind text bars or text blocks, but you will get a more detailed description in the slides I upload. So it's not really more content in the sense of more that you have to learn, but it contains some explanations that here in the lecture I only give orally. You can have a look at the slides of the previous year. That's true. I updated some small things, but nothing too big besides integrating the interactive stuff. So if you go to the website and navigate to the previous year, there this lecture set is called C2 Authentication, because last week we had one lecture less about cryptography. So if that helps you until the break, then I will upload the slides during the break. Okay, back to message authentication. So let's have a look at a few examples about where you encounter this stuff. And the reason why I start in this lecture with authenticity instead of the way more classical confidentiality is because authenticity is something that you actually see a lot more as a user. So as an example, something that I guess almost all of you have already seen is when you try to download something very big, such as a LaTeX distribution or a Linux distribution, what you often find online is you get a link to download your file over, for example, some torrent or so. But on the original website, you also find some files that include hash files. So this can be, for example, a .md5 or .sha something file, and sometimes also signature files. And if you have a look inside those, you see a checksum with some reasonable length. And once you download your file from the external source, like a torrent or so, you can then afterwards locally recompute the hash value of the file you downloaded and compare it with the hash value you found on the website. So what is the idea here? Of course, it's on the one hand to just protect against some download errors that happened, but you would usually find them out anyways. What it also protects against is against somebody distributing the incorrect file, a malicious file over the torrent, for example, which is considered the untrusted channel here. Whereas the website would be considered a trusted channel because it has certificates, only few people have access to changing this. So that's the basic idea. Who tells me that this value is not tampered with while transferring? You mean the hash value from the website? That's an excellent question. And this is because your connection to the website is usually, as I said, protected by some other means. For example, because it's an HTTPS connection, which has an authentication check included. So if something happened, then it would have to happen at one of the endpoints. So either somebody would tamper with the server, but well, that is a bigger problem that cannot be solved by cryptographic means, or somebody is manipulating the thing on my side. So if I have some malware installed or so that tampers with whatever my browser displays, yes, that can happen. But that's the general idea. So what other questions do we have here? If they infect the ISO, why not just also infect the SHA file? Well, because it's transmitted over a different channel. So the ISO is over torrent, where more people have the option to manipulate it, whereas fewer people are able to manipulate the website, whether on the server or in transit. Okay, usually the hash is directly on the website. Yes, exactly. So it makes no sense to download the hash and the file from the same source. It only makes sense against accidental mistakes, but it does not make sense to do that against an attacker, because then people are right. If you have both from the same source, then anybody who can manipulate the file can also manipulate the hash. There is one thing that protects against this part, and that is that we often get not only the hash, but also a signature. And the signature requires a private key to produce, and this is something that an adversary who attacks the transmission cannot manipulate. Because to do that, they would have to manipulate yet another source, namely the source of the public key. So you see that we always shift the trust to some other channel, which is easier to protect. So for example, protecting the website, which serves only a very small value, the hash, is easier because you can do the usual TLS, for example, than protecting and still serving a very big file. So here the separation of concerns makes sense. So another question, so you have one trusted website for the hash? Yes. And many untrusted services where you can download the executable? Yes, exactly. And then check if the untrusted source modified the executable. Exactly, that's an excellent summary of what's going on here. Let's have a look at another example where you have actually already seen the output of a crypto scheme. So here in the hash example, the hash value was produced by a crypto algorithm. Another application where you actually see the cryptographic output is if you're using Git. So in Git, you will, of course, know that all commits have a particular ID. And this ID is also a particular type of hash over the contents of this update. So here, the hash is not so much used as a protection against an adversary, unless you try to do, you add something like a signature to the to your tag, for example, then it protects. But otherwise, it's just used as a sort of fingerprint in order to identify and refer to a larger piece of data. So it's like finding a short version of the content that you can call it by, that you can use to refer to it. Another question, is this the same thing as Microsoft does with its executables, embedded certificates which verify that the binary is good? Well, Microsoft and other app stores do something more complicated than just serving the hash and the file. What they usually do is, indeed, they add a signature to it. So they don't just hash it, but they sign it with their private key. And your computer or your app store comes preloaded with the certificates that it should trust. And then with the certificates, it can verify that the signature is actually correct and from the owner of the certificate. But we will have a closer look at how this mechanism works in 2 and 3 weeks' time, where we're going to look at asymmetric crypto and at applications and higher level questions. Okay, one more application that I want to have a look at, and that is something where you not only read the output of cryptography, but where you actually have to type it. And this is what happens when you use something like Google Authenticator or some other TAN generator that you have installed on your smartphone, for example, and you use it in order to log in, for example, to your banking account. So what usually happens here is that your banking account where you try to log in first displays some short random value or not so random for you to verify the request. And then you can either confirm this request on your phone, or in the slightly more old style version with Google Authenticator, you don't get to just confirm, but you get on your phone some one-time password like this 345131 that you have to enter on the website in order to authenticate. And this value that you enter here is not just some random value, but this is actually computed by a cryptographic algorithm, and it depends on your identity and on the current time, which is why it's only valid for a short time. We will have a look at this protocol at the very end of the lecture. So these are a few applications. Let's now have a recap of the different schemes that we already mentioned now that all serve message authentication. So what all of these have in common is that they take a message, they take a message of arbitrary length and they add something to it, namely a fixed length tag typically. And this is a sort of checksum that verifies the integrity and authenticity. And in some cases, computing this tag requires some sort of key. So the first type does not require this sort of key, and that is, as I already mentioned, a hash function. So the idea here is that anybody can compute the tag, which is the value, the MD5 value, for example, that we saw earlier in the files example, but also anyone can verify it. So the sender and the receiver are sort of equivalent and everybody can do anything, which is why it classifies as a sort of symmetric cryptographic scheme. So it is symmetric in the sense of everybody has the same knowledge. It's not strictly speaking very cryptographic in the sense that it has no key, but we will see today that it uses exactly the same building blocks internally. Second, we have MACs, which are like hash functions, but they involve a shared secret key KAB between two people, A and B, Alice and Bob. And only these two people can compute the message authentication code, and only those two people can verify it. So this is, for example, something that's used inside of the TLS connection. So in the TLS connection, as part of that, you and the server agree on a shared secret key, and then you protect the messages you send each other with such a message authentication code. We have a third type, which we will not cover today, and that is signatures. So signatures have an asymmetric key inside, which means there is one person, Alice, who is the owner of the private key, and she is the only person who can actually compute the tag, whereas anyone else who just needs public information, namely the public key, can verify. So this is the sort of thing that is typically used, for example, for code signing, because only one person or one entity, namely, for example, Microsoft or whoever distributes your firmware updates or whoever, can sign the message, and everybody who has a device should be able to verify it based on public information. There is a question, what is TLS? Something like HTTPS. Oh, sorry, I forgot to be clear about that. So TLS is the protocol inside HTTPS. So this used to be called SSL, and some people still say that HTTPS is protected by SSL, but actually TLS has been the successor of SSL for many years. So if you ever see something that actually uses SSL to protect HTTPS, you might want to update your system and not trust this device. We will have a short look at TLS at the end of the third lecture, but you will hear a lot more about it in the network security lectures, because there we will also look at many details of the protocol, which messages it exchanges, how it works, and so on. What we're doing in the crypto part is essentially explaining all the ingredients of TLS. Of course, you could have looked it up, but by asking, you've spared many other people the need to look it up. So it's usually the case that if you're wondering something, chances are at least 3 other people are wondering about the same thing. So go ahead and ask. Okay, so these are the main cryptographic schemes for message authentication. We will see next week one variant of this one here that is called authenticated encryption, which is a combination of a MAC and an encryption scheme. Okay, so let's have briefly summarize a few more other applications and try to associate them with the right scheme. So we first said we had hash functions, which are authentication schemes without a key. These are, for example, used in the file download example or as identifiers for the files and commits, like we saw in Git. They're also often used to identify files in order to, for example, find identical files or to detect changes. So, for example, some sort of cloud system or system that manages your files might store hashes of all files and occasionally recompute them in order to check whether there were any changes. It can also be used for deduplication, so for detecting identical files and then merging them, so storing them only once. And only once one of the two file names of the same file receives some write request, then we split it again into 2 files. Another application that is responsible by far for the most hash evaluations on this planet, but that I would say does not maybe derive the most useful functionality for this, is linking blockchain blocks or also providing proofs of work for timestamping. A variant of hash functions is also used to store passwords. However, the schemes we need here for storing passwords have quite different additional requirements from usual hash functions. So you would not use the same sort of hash function here as for the others. We will get to that at the end of the lecture. And finally, something that a few people also do is to use hashes for committing to something. So like, for example, if they have some sort of prediction or they know something and they don't yet want to tell you the details, but they want to be able to prove at a later point that they already knew it today. What they can do is they can compute a hash of whatever information they have, publish the hash, and at the later point you reveal the message that led to this hash. And everybody can verify this knowledge that I later published actually hashes to the hash that was published earlier. Thus, the person must have already known it at this time. And this is, for example, often posted on Twitter, such a thing, an example of the hash, which is a bit confusing because it is a hashtag that is posted on Twitter, but it has nothing to do with Twitter hashtags in the sense of hash some keyword. For your lotto prediction tips, yes, that's something that you would use a commitment scheme for. So if you want to prove that you already know the lotto numbers ahead of time, use a commitment scheme with a hash function inside. Let's have a look at applications of the keyed variants. So one of the keyed schemes that we mentioned was max. These are on the one hand the schemes that I used inside these mobile TAN systems that I mentioned earlier. So where you have in Google Authenticator app some sort of key that you need to type. But they're also used as a part of many or of most secure communication protocols, such as TLS inside HTTPS or SSH. So when you make up an SSH connection to some server or to some other machine. Signatures, which we will not cover today, but in 2 weeks, are another keyed scheme where we have this asymmetry. So one person signs, everybody can verify, which is, for example, the basis of mobile signature schemes like you may have already used to sign some documents or to sign some petition that you submitted. They're also used, for example, when you sign your emails using PGP. Or they are, for example, also used as part of these communication protocols, but not for protecting the data that is transmitted, but in the very beginning to authenticate to each other. So you sign something like, "Hi, I'm the server and I want to talk to you." Okay, let's have a look at the first of these schemes, which is going to be hash functions or keyless authentication schemes. So what is a hash function? What is the interface? Now, on the next slide, there will be a tiny bit of math. Please don't look away, it's quite harmless. So let's define what a hash function is. We usually denote hash functions by age. And in this course, I'm always going to use calligraphic letters for cryptographic schemes. So calligraphic age is a hash function for me. Now, what sort of function is that? It takes as input a message of arbitrary bit length. So let's explain the notation here. F is short for finite field. This is a particular type of mathematical object. And the finite field with 2 elements is a complicated mathy way of saying bits. So F2, an element of F2 is simply a bit which can be 0 or 1. And by the star on top, as usual, we denote something with arbitrary length. So F2 to the power of something always means a bit string of the length indicated in the exponent. And if it's an asterisk, this means arbitrary length. So it takes an input of any length and maps it to an output of a fixed length, the length we are going to refer to as t, because t is also short for tag. That's what the output of this function is called. So we denote the input, the message, by m, and the output by t, like tag. Now the hash output actually has many values, many names. Some people call it the hash value, some people call it the hash output, some people call it the hashtag. That's all the same thing. So in illustrations, a hash is usually illustrated like this sort of filter thing here, because it takes a bigger input, or it accepts inputs that are bigger than its output. It also accepts very short messages, so you could also hash a 1-byte message, but you could also hash 1 gigabyte. The output result, the tag, would always have the same length. And what this scheme does is it moves the challenge of protecting the authenticity of the original message to having to protect the authentication tag instead. This is exactly what we saw in the file download example. So instead of somehow protecting the entire 5 gigabyte Linux image from my untrusted channel like torrent, I only protect, for example, by signing or by transmitting securely on the website, its hashtag. So there are some questions here. How do we assure that some string does not generate the same hash? I'll get to that in a moment. choose hash functions where it's very unlikely. Yes, exactly. Is there a maximum length of f star? Well, yes, theoretically. So some things that many hash values encode something like the length of the message as part of the process that it computes. We will get to that a bit later this lecture. And this length value is, for example, something like a 64-bit integer. So your message cannot be longer than 2 to the 64 bits. But good luck and have fun actually computing or generating 2 to the 64 bits of data. So yes, there is theoretically an upper limit, but it's usually so high that it's computationally infeasible to actually produce this much data. What is the best hash algorithm? We will get to that. Depends on your needs, exactly. We will see a list of a few hash algorithms later. Yes. So how do you actually use a hash function? So I will have these sort of images with Alice, Bob, and Eve for most of the schemes I introduce, and they describe a sort of mini protocol about how to use a scheme. So in this case here, what we start with is Alice wants to send a message M to Bob. Instead of sending it directly, because we have an untrusted channel here, what Alice does is she puts the message into the hash algorithm, gets a tag, and then transmits the message over the insecure channel, which is maybe cheap and easy to do, but she has to transmit the tag in some secure manner. For example, by choosing a more expensive but secure channel to transmit it, like a website, or put it inside a signature, or hand it to them separately, or in many applications where hashes are used, you will always have to question how the tag is transmitted. What Bob then does is, upon receiving the message and the tag, is that Bob puts the message into the same hash function, gets their own version of the tag, t prime, and then compares whether t prime, so prime is the mathematical English name for this little apostrophe here, so the Bob then needs to compare whether the recomputed hash matches the transmitted hash. If yes, then they trust that the data is was not modified in this context and is actually from Alice or from whoever sent him this tag. Yeah, and if it does not match, then something must have gone wrong. Typically, the file was modified in transit by Eve. There are a few other things that are almost called hash functions, or that some people confuse with hash functions, with classical hash functions. The one is password hashing functions or key derivation functions. So these are a sort of hash functions, but they have different requirements from a normal hash. So in particular, while a normal hash is supposed to be fast, a password hash is supposed to be slow. And one example for a good password hashing function is PBKDF2, password-based key derivation function version 2. We will mention a few other ones later this lecture. Another type that you should not confuse it with is non-cryptographic hash functions. These are hash functions that are, for example, used in a hash table, where you simply want to compress some data you have to some value which doesn't have to satisfy any particular security properties. It just should be reasonably uniformly distributed. So for example, you do this when you want to store your data in a hash table, which means you need to compute some index for it. For this, you hash it, and as long as the hashes are reasonably uniform, it's okay. It's no matter if it's easy to find two different values which hash to the same value, so that's not a problem. In cryptography, this is a problem. So non-cryptographic hash functions usually need to be a lot faster than cryptographic hashes, and they need to satisfy no real security properties. So they're usually a lot weaker than cryptographic hash functions. There is another type that it can be confused with, and that is error detection or error correcting codes and checksums, like for example cyclic redundancy checks, CRC32, which produces a 32-bit checksum. This is sometimes also used when transmitting data, but not to find out if an attacker modified something, but just to detect an accidental transmission error. So for example, error correcting codes are used on CDs in order and to detect whether the data that is read from the disk is actually correct. And if an error is detected, for example, it can be tried to reread the value or re-request the value, or sometimes the hash or the checksum in this case even contains some information that helps to recover the original correct value, even if there was a transmission error. These do not protect against adversaries because it's easy for an adversary to find alternative messages that lead to the same checksum. And also because the output is usually very short. So error detecting codes usually add just a few bits to the message because their main thing is to be efficient and to detect particular types of accidental errors, like burst errors or bit flips or a particular type. Can we repair data with CRC32? Yes, there are error correcting codes which can do that. So some of the most famous codes are Hamming codes or BCD codes, which are used, for example, on CDs, as I mentioned. So these things exist, but they are not cryptographic objects. You may learn about them maybe if you take some classes on different sorts of signal processing. For example, network people often work with these sort of checksums. Okay, there's a video recommendation on Hamming codes. So Hamming codes are reasonably easy to understand. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, give it a go. But let's get back to crypto, where things have actually security properties. And there are three classical security properties of hash functions. Let's go through them one by one. The first one is called pre-image resistance. So what this property says is that given an authentication tag, it must be infeasible for an attacker, meaning impossible to do in practical time. So it must be infeasible to find any message that hashes to this tag. So what does this protect against? For example, if your hash is published on the Ubuntu website and then you want it to be impossible for an attacker to come up with some image file that actually hashes to this value. So with some malicious code that does that. This is sort of protecting against somebody who modifies the transmission or also maybe the recipient of the file. This is who this protects against. And what we have here is all of these properties have so-called generic complexities. What a generic complexity is the complexity, so the cost of an attack that an adversary can always try. But this cost depends on the parameters of the function. So if we have a hash function with t-bit output, then there are 2 to the t possible output values. So if an attacker just goes and tries random messages m and hashes them and sees whether they accidentally get the correct output tag, then after approximately on average 2 to the t trials, they will by accident find a message which produces the right tag, giving them a pre-image. So finding a pre-image is something that is not impossible. It usually just costs way too much. So what this means is that the value t, the size of the hash value, must be chosen large enough to protect against this attack. There is a closely related attack which is called second pre-image resistance. What this says is that if the attacker is given not only a tag, but an actual message that hashes to this tag, then it must be impossible for them to find a second different message m prime that produces the same hash value. So what's the difference between the two? In this case, the attacker is given only one tag and needs to find one pre-image. And in this case, the attacker is already given one pre-image, but is asked to find a second one. So this is a sort of special case of this one here. And this is also the case that you typically have in things like file downloads, because the attacker already knows one pre-image, namely the correct Ubuntu file, for example. But what they want to find is a different modified version of this executable, for example, that hashes to the same value. And for this reason, the generic attack, the best one, is also pretty much the same. You just try random m primes until you hit the right hash value by accident. So same complexity. Finally, we have a third property which may be a tiny bit more difficult to understand and which has a slightly different person that it protects against. Namely, whom this protects against is a malicious sender. And what this property says is that it must be infeasible for an attacker to come up with any two different messages m and m prime that have the same hash. So what's the difference between these two? In this one here, one message is already given, so the hash tag is also already fixed. But we need to come up with one other message that matches it. What we're supposed to come up with here is two messages that we can construct and choose from scratch. We are not forced to hit a particular tag, we just want to hit the right tag. So the scenario here is, for example, some employee at Microsoft could prepare two versions of an update. A good one, a nice one that does everything it's supposed to do, and an evil one that does something malicious. Now, the person at Microsoft will give the good version to the code reviews and so on, obtain the Microsoft hash signature for it, or the signature over the hash. So we'll have it certified, the good one, and then they will exchange the data for the good executable or the good update with the evil one. And the hash value and the signature will still match because it hashes to the same value. So this is about somebody who prepares two files in advance, and then once the tag is transmitted over the secure channel, for example by signing it, they exchange the message for another one. And the important thing here is this is a lot easier to do than any of the above. In particular, the complexity for this is not 2 to the t, but 2 to the t divided by 2 trials. So in other words, by square root of 2 to the power of t, which is a lot less than the thing above. So it's not just half as much time, but it's exponentially faster. I see there are a few questions. Let's catch up. Do we learn about how to produce correct collisions? So how to find collisions? I'll get to that in a moment, but here there is a slight difference to last year. So there's one algorithm I'm not covering this year because we're already taking way too long with the interactive stuff. It's infeasible for any hash function. So yes, I will explain to you the generic attack, but of course for real hash functions like SHA-2, t is always chosen large enough so that not only these two attacks are practically infeasible, but also this one is. Blah, blah, blah. Not that you want to do it, blah, 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 but ideas with countermeasures and so on. The main countermeasure to protect against these attacks is first to have a secure primitive inside, which is complicated and which I can't explain to you how to do in this lecture. And the second thing to do is choose a hash function which has a large t. How large? I will get to that in a moment. So no, it's generally not easy to find two messages which have the same tag because we choose t large enough that it's hard. So let's have a look at why this is so much cheaper than these ones here. So why protecting against a malicious sender is so much harder than protecting against somebody who modifies the transmission. You don't get yet why collisions are so much faster, which is why I will explain it to you on this slide here. So the reason why this is so much easier is due to the so-called birthday paradox. What does this say? So the original version of the birthday paradox is very simple. It's simply an observation that if you have a room and you have only 23 people inside the room, then there is a very high chance, so approximately 50%, that two of them actually have the same birthday. So that their birthdays collide. This is different from the question when you enter a room, is there somebody who has the same birthday as you who are entering the room? because in that case, you will need approximately 360 people to have a good chance of somebody having the same birthday as you personally. But if you're just asking if there are any two people who have the same birthday with each other, then suddenly only 23 people is enough. So this is actually just putting different numbers on exactly this statement here. So our number of cases here is not 2 to the t, but 365. And the 2 to the t divided by 2 in this case is 23. So let's have a look at why that is. And what an attacker actually does in order to find a collision. So a simple algorithm of doing that, not the more advanced, slightly fast one. So the simple thing that an attacker can do is they can start producing random messages and collecting their tags. All the messages are supposed to be different, and they do this for approximately 2 to the t divided by 2 messages, which is the final complexity we want to have. Now, after they have done that, they now have a large amount of messages and their hash values. Now, the important thing is that in this set of possible hash values, they now have 2 to the t divided by 2 choose 2, so das über das in German, this many pairs. So to remind you of this notation, this binomial notation, this is the number of options how you can choose this many values from this many values, which is why the English name of this thing is n choose k. So there are this many pairs, so any two people you can select from, or any two tags you can select from this set here, gives you a possible candidate pair that could potentially have a collision. Now, if you fill in the formula for n choose k, then you get that this value here is approximately the number on top squared divided by 2, where of course 2 to the t over 2 to the power of 2 is exactly 2 to the t, and we still have the divided by 2. So the number of possible pairs of messages or of tags that we can generate is approximately 2 to the power of t. So we have this many candidate pairs. Now, what is the probability that one candidate pair actually is the collision we're searching for? Well, we have a collision in case the tag of the second message matches exactly the tag of the first message. Now, let's say the first message has a fixed tag. There are now 2 to the t possible options for the tag of the second message, and only one of them is correct. So 1 divided by 2 to the t is the probability that one particular pair I'm looking at is the right one. So if I have 2 to the t many candidates approximately, and each one has a success probability of about 1 divided by 2 to the t, then in total the probability that I have a match is approximately this times this, or the expected number of matches is this times this, which is approximately 1 match, or if we account for this one here, half a match on average. So what this means is that because I have so many candidate pairs from this few individual messages, the likelihood that one of the pairs is correct is very high. So this is the main idea of why collisions are so much faster. So the main reason is you have so many candidate pairs if you have a relatively small set of people. So in the case of the birthday paradox, you have, when you have 23 people, you have approximately 23 times 22 divided by too many pairs, and each of them has a chance of 1 over 365 to be a collision, which is approximately, if you multiply that up, it's approximately 1/2 or 50%. So that's the main idea. Now I've been saying all the time that what we are looking for is a no, we don't need any factorials here, or we would need them if we actually try to evaluate this, but you can simply cancel out things here. So what we said is what we want to have is that this complexity, so generating this many messages, should be hard. So the question, of course, is what exponent makes this hard? So this is why I've included some table here about which sorts of powers of 2 complexity are reasonably feasible. Now, of course, this depends a lot on your parameters. It depends on how much money you are willing to spend, how much time you are willing to wait, what sort of 2 to the something are we talking about? Is it a fast cryptographic hash function or a much slower password hash function, and so on. So there are many parameters this depends on. In summary, I think this provides a reasonable overview. So what do we have here? I'm evaluating 3 different metrics here. And the first metric is how easy is it for an attacker to spend this much time, measured in cipher calls or hash evaluations, because you need, for example, to try as many hashes. Then how much does it cost to have this much memory? And how much or how feasible is it to collect this much data in a practical scenario? So for time, 2 to the 32 is probably something you've already done often, maybe. I don't know. It's typically trivial. So it takes, for example, a few seconds. 2 to the 48 is an order of magnitude that's still what I would call easy, in the sense of if an attacker wants to do that, they just can. They might have to wait a few hours or maybe even a few days, depending on how many cores they have, but it's absolutely feasible for anyone to do that. 2 to the 64 is what I consider practical here. Now, practical does not mean, oh, it's useful, I want to do that, but it means it's practically possible if you have a lot of money or a lot of time. You are probably not able to do this, but I'm pretty sure that Google or NSA are able to do this. So it's not something or a security level that I would choose if I want to protect against all sorts of attackers. If we go higher up, we get something like 2 to the 80. This is something that I would call unpractical. So probably not even Google is willing to spend this much time on attacking a particular person, or NSA or whoever. However, I wouldn't rely on this for the further future. So if I want to have a crypto system which is secure for the next 10 years and against large-scale adversaries, this is not a security level you want to choose. And finally, we get to the area of absolutely infeasible. So this is something like 2 to the 128 or 2 to the 256. This is just absolutely impossible to do, and I would vouch that this is also impossible to do in the next 100 years or so. So this is something where it would feel absolutely safe. Let's see what questions we get there. People are discussing the birthday paradox. Yeah, so you've reasonably concluded that 23 choose 2 is not exactly 365. It's a bit lower, but it still gives you the right probability. I'm sorry, I can't re-explain everything of that in detail because we will run out of time. Let's see if there are some other questions. Otherwise, if you're still very unsure about the birthday paradox, I'm happy to discuss that later on Discord or something like that. What is the benefit for an attacker to have any 2 messages that have the same hash? If they're both random, I don't see a way to tamper the communication. That's a very good observation. The thing is that once you're able to do random collisions, you're often are able to do that so not constructing 2 completely random messages, but due to the way that hash functions are constructed, which we will see in a moment, what an attacker can often do is generate 2 messages that are random, but that have a non-random prefix and maybe postfix. So where the first part of the message is identical, then they introduce some random garbage using this birthday trick here, and then they again have, for example, a common postfix. And due to the way that many file formats are constructed, there is often place for some random data to go, or for some data that contains things like an index where something should jump, or the length of something, and changing that can often change the content of the file. If you're interested in that, then I invite you to have a look at my homepage at EAK. There is a link there to a scientific paper we did, which is called Malicious SHA-2, and where we demonstrated that even by having these random looking collisions, you can actually construct things like two PDF documents with different content, but the same hash value. Or two RAR archives, which have a different content, and where only a slight, if you look at the binary, only a slight part of the file is different, but most of it is the same. So have a look at this Malicious SHA-1 on my website if you want some details about how to use such collisions in collaboration with an expert on file formats. Okay, yeah, we were talking about memory. And for memory, the thing is that memory is usually more costly than the same unit in time. So for example, while 2 to the 32 time is completely trivial, takes a few seconds, 2 to the 32 memory, depending on how large the cipher output is several gigabytes. So storing that in RAM, for example, may already be a bit challenging. And having 2 to the 48 of that is already pretty hard and pretty expensive. It's probably not something that you want to do. And similarly, the other ones are also more difficult. Also, for collecting data, this is generally pretty difficult. So forcing a victim to do something like 2 to the 32 cipher evaluations is possible, but not really easy usually. So there have been examples where people demonstrated that. For example, attacks on some configurations of TLS, where they triggered, for example, a VPN user to generate this much data, but it's not always possible. So in general, memory and data are a bit more expensive than the same amount of time. But still, they're usually captured by the same sort of security level, and n-bit security means that an attacker would need about 2 to the n of a particular unit. Typically, the main thing is computation time, in order to have a good success probability of breaking the scheme. And based on the previous slide, 128-bit security is very widely accepted as an excellent choice for most applications. What does this mean for hash functions? We saw that for hash functions, the cost is usually 2 to the t divided by 2. So if you want to have 2 to the 128 security or attack cost, then our hash output size needs to be twice that size. It needs to be 256 bits. So this is the minimum size you should aim for when using a hash function. There are some people who prefer higher security levels, for example, 256-bit security, which is seen as an exaggeration by some people, but on the other hand, it's often not that much more expensive. So the attack cost increases exponentially, whereas the execution cost increases just a bit. And it's also more relevant in a post-quantum setting. I see there are tons of questions. We're already a bit behind time, so let me have a very quick look at that. Maybe I will also have a look at that during the break and answer afterwards. In the meantime, let's jump on to how to actually construct hash messages. And what all of these schemes we're going to look at are constructed by is they always iterate an internal primitive. And the reason is we said that a hash function is supposed to process messages of arbitrary length. But of course, we can only build building blocks with a fixed length. And these building blocks are called primitives, and we need to iterate them in order to process all parts of our message. So for example, to translate the message block by block, or to accumulate information from successive blocks in order to combine them into one hash value. And there are quite a number of primitives that we use in cryptography. By far the most well-known one is the block cipher. So what does a block cipher do? It is usually denoted by E, like encryption, and it translates a message X or M, a message block of fixed size, to a ciphertext block of the same size, configured by a key. Now the key also goes into this algorithm here. We usually denote with this little edge here which of the inputs is the key input. There are also other primitives such as compression functions. What do these do? They compress a larger input into a smaller one. So this sounds a bit like a hash function. The main difference is the compression function only accepts an input of fixed size. So typically what it does is it takes an input chaining value and combines it with some message block X, compresses them together and produces a new chaining value which has the same size as the input chaining value. And then there are other ones, like for example permutations, which are like block ciphers but without a key input and typically with a larger input and output. So let's have a closer look at the one primitive that is the most classical to use for hash functions. I guess you can already guess which one that is. Somebody mentions they've also heard of stream ciphers. Yes, stream ciphers are another type of building block that most people call a primitive. I'm not going to cover them in this lecture. We're going to briefly mention them in next week. Okay, so let's continue here and let's have a closer look at compression functions. So like I already said, they are sometimes written vertically like this or horizontally like this. So the input is here and the output is here. In any case, they take some input data and update it based on some message block. And we denote by m the message length and by t the length of the intermediate value. So in total there are 2 to the t plus m possible inputs and 2 to the t possible outputs. And t again gives us a bound on the security level, because like in a hash function, for a smaller t it's more likely to have collisions in this output of the compression function here. And for larger t, we get larger values which may be a bit harder to process. So this already looks almost like a hash function, but with the one important difference that it doesn't accept arbitrary length inputs. But the good thing about compression functions is we know how to build them. So building something that processes a fixed input size and produces a fixed output size is relatively easy. Okay, so how do we now use a message, a compression function to build a hash function? Somebody's asking, is it lossless? No, it's absolutely not lossless, because it can compress a larger input to a smaller output, and it can accept any input and will produce an output. So because there are more possible inputs than outputs, it's guaranteed that some different inputs will produce the same output, producing a loss. So hash functions are not something that is concerned with compressing data in the sense of like a zip archive so that you can recover the original data. It does the opposite. It tries to compress stuff but make it impossible to recover the input again. Okay, so how do we use a compression function to hash something? It's actually pretty straightforward. What we simply do is we use this building block to successively process the blocks of our message. So we take the original input message m, which can have any number of blocks, so it can be very long. We chop it into blocks of the right size, and when we absorb them one by one with our compression functions. So the number of compression function calls we do, it's the same as the number of message blocks we have. And we always feed the output of one compression function as an input or chaining value into the next function. So the line on the bottom is sort of the state, and we always update it with the message blocks. We do have to start somewhere. This is called the initial value, h0, which is, for example, 0 or some constant. This must be specified by the hash function. So you can't choose it randomly. It must be written in the spec what the initial value is. And then we produce the final tag, which is simply the output of the last call to the compression function. The question is this where you use a salt? No, the salt doesn't get into here. So hash functions do not, so cryptographic hash functions do not have a salt input, which is one of the differences compared to password hashing functions. In a password hashing function, you could use something like an initial value as a salt, but usually this is done a bit differently. Okay, so this is the general construction. Yeah, so no salt and pepper here. This is for password hashing functions only. Okay, now some of you might have wondered, I now said that the data is simply chopped into blocks and that's it. The question is, what if the length of the message isn't actually a multiple of the block length? So for example, what if the message I want to hash is just 1 byte long, but my compression function wants 128-bit inputs, for example? What do we do then? What we do then is called padding. I don't know if I've said the name of this construction yet. It's called the Merkel-Darmstadt hashing construction, or MD construction. So one of the suggestions is to pad with zeros. That is a good idea as a starting point, but maybe some of you can already see a problem with simply padding with zeros. So what is the problem if I hash my message by just appending zeros? Imagine that one of the messages I want to hash is just 1 byte long, with for example, it's a 1 letter or something, and I pad it with zeros. And there's a second message I want to send, which starts with the same letter, then continues with a 0 and has length 2, for example, and I would also pad it up with zeros. Now both of these messages would be padded up to the same padded message. Somebody's asking what to pad is. So to pad is usually in clothes or so. Padding is something soft that you use to fill something up. So in this case, it's also something soft to fill up the block, meaning soft meaning it's as long as it needs to be to fill it up to the next block length. Okay, so yeah, if I want to hash 1 0 and 1, padding with zeros would yield the same output in both cases, which would mean I would have found a collision, which is a bad thing. So we need something a bit more clever to pad it with. There are already a few suggestions in the chat here. The thing, or the way that Merkel-Darmstadt construction does it, does actually 2 things. The first thing it does is it fills it up to the next block length, more or less, but by adding not just zeros, but adding at least 1 bit 1 and then filling it up with zeros. So if you ignore this part here for a moment and just consider this, then it already solves the problem of the previous suggestion. So in this case, the message 1 and the message 1 0 would be padded to different things. Namely, one would be padded to 1 1 zeros and the other one to 1 0 1 and many zeros, where I'm mixing bits and bytes a bit, but I hope you get the idea. So this already fixes the main problem. However, Merkel-Darmstadt does a bit more. It also appends the length of the message as a 64-bit integer. Now, this is not as obviously necessary as the other stuff here, but it's necessary for the security proof. This here also adds to the security, but it's one of the main reasons it's there is to make the proof a bit easier. The exact padding scheme is always specified as part of the cryptographic scheme. So if you read the specification, you will not only find such pictures, but you will also find the rules on how to pad a message. And so this is done so that the total length of message plus 1 plus zeros plus 64 bits is a multiple of the block length. And the important thing is you always must use this padding, not just if your last block is incomplete. So if your message is already a multiple of the block length, you must still add this padding, otherwise you will run into the same sort of problem that we saw with the zero padding. Okay, now I originally wanted to cover the simple security proof of this construction here, but we're already so much over time that I'm afraid I will need to skip it. However, you will find a text description of it in the uploaded slides. So let's just jump over it and have a little break and a break quiz. Now, the break is going to have to be a bit shorter, so something like 10 minutes or so, because we've already taken a bit longer than planned, because you have so many messages, so many questions, which is great, but I didn't plan it in when timing my lecture. Okay, so let me just post the link to the break quiz in the description. And then let's meet again in 10 minutes, meaning at 3 minutes past 11. So there we go. You should now be able to find the link to the quiz, which is again Google Docs time. You will find it in the description of the YouTube stream. Maybe some of you is so nice and copies it to Discord. And while you're having fun with the break quiz, which works in exactly the same way as last time, so let's just show it here. Let's again do the same thing as last time. So you pick a number between 0 and 9, that's your team, and you are responsible for filling the corresponding slots in the table. This time you will see that sometimes some of the teams get slightly different questions. What I also suggest is that we just go very briefly over this after the break, and if you want a more detailed discussion, we'll do that in Discord afterwards. So in the meantime, have fun with your break and see you again in 9 minutes. So in the meantime, we have another guest here. Same cat as yesterday, didn't want to come. I guess she didn't enjoy it too much, but here's another one instead. So I guess it's not shoulder cat, but it's invisible cat on this slide deck. So we'll start again in approximately 1 minute. Okay, there we go again. Let's have a look at what you produced in the meantime. So, lots of fights about animals. Okay. New words or concepts you learned so far. So I see petting was indeed new to some people. Maybe the concept, maybe the word. Oh, come on. Don't troll too much, please. Thank you. Okay. Somebody learned fidelity, which we said is not a crypto term, but still useful nevertheless. Let's have a look at the other ones. Name an application example for Macs or digital signatures. Yeah, these all look pretty good. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Let's try if you can make it so that I can read it and you can hear me. So what do we have here? Applications examples for hash functions and a security property. So people seemed a bit in doubt about the one of three security properties. What I mean here is either pre-image resistance or second pre-image resistance or collision resistance. So for example, check if the download file is corrupted, and pre-image resistance is a perfectly good answer here. Hash tables none is also a good answer, but it's not exactly what I meant. Okay, the other ones I think should work a bit on their security properties. So sometimes it's collision resistance that's more important. So for example, you could think about if you do a password hash, which of these is more important? Is it collision resistance or pre-image resistance? Then we have suitable bit sizes for the following. Block cipher key 128 or 256 sounds great. Plain text 256 sounds good, but both teams posted the same thing. Hash function output 256 is great. Somebody says at least 128. Well, I wouldn't trust a 128-bit hash value because this number of hash functions evaluations that is required to break that is approximately what the Bitcoin network does in less than 1 second. Though of course if you do it personally you will take a lot longer. Then we have Merkle-Darmstadt chaining value 256, absolutely correct. Compression function output 32 bits. That is a bit too small because the compression function output is used exactly as the Merkle-Darmstadt chaining value. So it's like an intermediate hash value. So it must be at least as large as the final hash value to make sense. Security level 128 sounds great. And padding the integer with the message length. Yes, 46-bit, 64 bits is a good example. and this is what we saw as an example in most Merkle-Darmstadt ciphers. What else do we have here? How long does it take and how dangerous is this? So here we have, for example, hashing 1 megabyte. Yes, absolutely easy, less than 1 second. Hashing 1 terabyte of zeros. People say it's unpractical. This is actually pretty practical. So it may take, depending on where you read the data from and whether you generate your zeros or you read them from the hard disk. If you read it from the hard disk, then the reading part will definitely be the slow part. If you generate them from scratch, it may take something like half an hour or a few hours, but it's definitely feasible. Not something you want to do 5 times a day, but okay. 2 to the 32 hash evaluations. People here say 1 minute. That is true, but that's a relatively slow hash function then. 2 to the 32 hash evaluations and storing this many tags. Well, the evaluations are easy, but storing this many tags is definitely not. So this is many hundreds of gigabytes. 2 to the 48 hash evaluations and storing them. So this is actually easier than the previous one because we said time is less costly than storage. Collecting this many blocks an hour, yeah, that depends of course a lot on the application. 1 hour would be a possible time frame. It can also be a lot longer depending on the application. 2 to the 64 hash evaluations, weeks to months. I think that's a good estimate. Unless you're the Bitcoin network, then you do it in 1 second because there are just so many resources burning for you. 2 to the 128 hash evaluations, too long, impossible. Yes, absolutely. 2 to the 32 hash evaluations, trivial. That's true. However, evaluating RSA is approximately something like a factor of 1000 slower than a hash evaluation or a block cipher evaluation. So if you think of, if you try to think of how long it actually takes, things you need to take into account are how long does executing one of these things take. So for example, if you do pure AES encryption and you use your inbuilt instructions that your CPU comes with, then you may achieve something like very roughly 1 cycle per byte or so. Meaning to process something like 2 to the 32 bytes of data, you would need something like 2 to the 32 cycles, which if you think about it, you have probably a few gigahertz. Gigahertz corresponds to 2 to the 30 evaluations or cycles. So this would mean that doing 1 gigabyte of data is very roughly 1 second. Maybe a bit less, maybe it's 5 seconds, but something in that range. And if RSA is 1000 times slower, this is more like in the range of half an hour or so. Finally, we have encrypting 1 gigabyte with AES. Well, we just did an example in this direction. And cat attack. How long infinite? Well, that would probably be fun. Okay, what else do we have here in the quiz? Some people who are watching. Okay, that looks good. What are the fastest generic attacks? Okay, there aren't too many answers here yet. Maybe this is something you want to revisit after the lecture and discuss the answers on Discord. And we have some Bitcoin fans here, very shiny, very shiny. And lots of other stuff, which all must have arrived after I checked. So have fun scrolling through that. Oh, more Bitcoin stuff and more cats. Okay, great. Thanks a lot for joining in. I'll just go back to my slides now, which are probably something like here. And I need to switch back to this view. That sounds good. Okay, and here I also need to switch back to the comments. Okay, so there are some people who are worried about the slides. You should have been able to find them both in the description of the YouTube video and on Discord. I'm sorry the upload to the website takes a bit more steps. I wasn't able to do that. Okay, that is wrong because I'm in the wrong window. But here I'm in the right window. So as promised, now let's have a look at a few widely used hash functions and how secure they are. So these are the hash functions that were used either in the previous TLS version 1.2 or in the current version 1.3, both of which are still good to use, and which of them I hope will be added sometime in the near future. So all these first few hash functions you see here, they were all standardized by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, in the US. And most of them have a short name like SHA something, where SHA stands for Secure Hash Algorithm. And all of these first few here follow the Merkle-Darmstadt construction that we saw on the right before the break. So there is one cipher here, MD5, which has been broken for ages. So this was first broken in the mid-90s, but is unfortunately still around and was even still accepted in the previous TLS version. And people have been able to produce practical collisions for this since 2004. We have then the successor of MD5, which is called SHA-1. You see this one already has a bigger hash size, so the original hash size was so small that even for generic reasons it would have to be considered broken. This one here, so the first academic attacks on this were published right after the previous one, but it took until I think 2017 for somebody to actually publicly, so for a team of researchers to actually publicly produce a collision. And the effort they had to invest for that was approximately 2 to the 63 evaluations. So you see this is less than the generic complexity here. And this is because the internals of these functions are not perfectly secure. So there are some problems in there that people were able to exploit. Now SHA-1 is actually still accepted in TLS 1.3, so the current up-to-date standard, but only for legacy certificates. So they're already aware that this is should no longer be considered secure and is not accepted for new certificates, only for old ones. Then we have the SHA-2 family, which is the successor of SHA-1, and has been around also for many years already, and it has not been broken yet. So actually the best practical attacks on SHA-2 that are known, like collisions or so-called semi-free start collisions, they were actually published by our team at TU Graz and by some colleagues who have left by now. So this function here comes in different variants with different sizes for different security levels. So the most widely used ones are this one here, because it achieves the standard 128-bit security, and also this one here, because it isn't really slower on modern CPUs, but it produces a higher security level. So in particular, this one here is actually optimized for 32-bit processors and this one for 64-bit processors. So on modern CPUs, this one is typically as fast as the other one or even a bit faster and has a higher security as well. So these are definitely recommended to use right now. Now, one downside of all of these is that they were not chosen in a public process or in a public competition. So while the specs are published, their exact designer's ideas or the design criteria are not. And they were developed in collaboration with the NSA. So some people are not as trusting towards these, but I personally have a lot of confidence in SHA-2. But after the attacks on these two here, since SHA-2 follows a similar design principle, NIST thought it would be a good idea to hold a public competition for an alternative to SHA-2. So SHA-2 isn't broken or replaced yet, but they thought it would be good to have a backup plan in case there are problems. And this backup plan is SHA-3, which has now been published for a couple years, but is not yet integrated in the new TLS versions, which is a pity because it's pretty efficient, it's very elegant, it's very secure, and it has some very fresh ideas that make it suitable to a wider range of platforms than the upper ones. So this was chosen in a public competition which was held from 2007 to 2012, and designed as a complement to SHA-2. So the idea is it should look very different. So if some problem is found with the original algorithm, it should definitely not apply to the new one. And for this competition, there was a total of 64 submissions from over 200 cryptographers worldwide, which were then successively narrowed down in several competition rounds until there were 5 finalists. One of them also co-designed by some people from Graz. And finally, one of these, namely the nowadays SHA-3, but then called Checksums design, won the competition for a very good reason, I think. And what's interesting about this Checksums or SHA-3 design is that it does not follow the Merkle-Darmstadt strategy that we saw earlier. So instead, it does not have a compression function inside it has a permutation, which is illustrated here, called P. And the construction they use it in was newly introduced, and it's called the sponge construction. So sponge, or in German Schwamm, is like something that can absorb a lot of water, and then you can squeeze it and get the water back out. And this is the basic idea of the construction. So it first absorbs the message. You see here that unlike the compression function here, the output is the same size as the input of the function. And in between the calls, we always XOR in the message blocks, apply the permutation, XOR in, and so on. So this is the absorbing phase, where the idea is a bit similar as in the Merkle-Darmstadt construction, but you see the differences. And at the end, once we've absorbed all the message we wanted, we squeeze back out the result, and we always just work with one part of the state. So you see there are always 2 lines, the so-called inner part, the bit size of which is called the capacity, and then we have the outer part here, which is what interacts with the outer world, either by XORing in stuff or by outputting stuff. And this is called, so the bit size of this is called the rate. And so the total size of this thing is an R plus C bit input and an R plus C bit output. And in case of SHA-3, for example, this R plus C is 1600, which is on the one hand for security reasons. So this part has an influence on the security, but also for efficiency, because the larger you make this part here, the faster it absorbs the message blocks, because more bits fit in every time. And also the faster you get out the tag you want. And one advantage of this design is that you cannot just get the fixed size output like in SHA-1 and that's it. But if you need more, you can actually generate a longer stream from what you had. This is called an extendable output function, or XOF. Okay, so this is an alternative approach for hashing that has become quite popular since the election of SHA-3. Now let's jump over to not a different construction, but a completely different type of function, namely message authentication codes. So what is the difference between a message authentication code and a hash function? You will see that the picture looks somewhat similar and the mathy notation also looks similar, but the one difference is that we now add a key input in addition to the message. So in this writing here, we have a function hk, k is for the key, so it's a keyed hash function, which takes as input first a k-bit block, which is the key, k, and a block of, or a message of arbitrary length, which is again called m. And it outputs again a tag of fixed size t. And what we do here is the challenge of protecting the message is now changed into the challenge of protecting the secret key. So this is different. Before we transformed the challenge to protecting the tag, now we transform it to protecting the key. What do I mean by that? If you look at the same picture as before, you see that most of it is the same. So Alice, if she wants to protect something, she computes the tag by using the key and the message. She then sends both the message and the tag over the untrusted channel. So this is different from before. And then Bob receives the message, has also a copy of the same key, so that they need to distribute this key beforehand. Also recomputes the tag and checks whether it's correct. So the big difference to before is that now the tag can be transmitted over the insecure channel because Eve cannot modify it without detection. And this is because the tag was computed using the secret key. So what we need to protect now is the key, which should not be leaked, so Eve must not know this key. So what is the security notion we have here? Before we had this pre-image and collision stuff. Now we have a different property that we want to achieve, and this is called unforgeability. So to forge in German is fälschen or schmieden, and it means to create an input to generate a value that you shouldn't be able to generate. So in this case, a forgery is if somebody is able to come up with the correct tag for a message without knowing the key. So what should be infeasible for the attacker is finding any combination of a message and a corresponding tag that they came up with themselves and they didn't just read from a previous transmission. So of course, once somebody sends M and T, the attacker knows it as well. So this one doesn't count as an attack, but as soon as they come up with a new combination of a message and the tag that they haven't seen before, the attacker is counted as successful. So similar as before, we can ask what are generic attacks here. There are actually two now. One of them is a bit similar as before. What we can do is, of course, we can guess the output tag. So now instead of changing the message until it meets a fixed key, fixed tag, what we can simply do is we write down a message and just guess any key, so any value for the T bits of the tag, and see if it's correct. And if this is a T bit output, then with probability 1 divided by 2 to the T, our randomly guessed tag is actually correct. So again, T has an influence on the security. The other thing an attacker can do is to guess not the tag for a particular message, but they can try to guess the key. And they can verify this guess if they already know some combinations of M and T. They can simply verify whether their guessed key matches this message to this tag. And if yes, it's probably the correct key. So the complexity of this now depends on the key size, because there are again 2 to the key possible options. So how do we construct a MEC? There are 2 main ways to do this, and both of them is from building blocks we've seen at least briefly. So the first option is to construct a MEC from a hash function. So that would mean that we take a publicly specified hash function, apply it to the message, and we somehow need to get the key into this as well. And one option to do this is, for example, to append the key to the message. And one construction that is widely used and that does something like this with a few extra tweaks is the so-called HMAC construction. So MAC is, as before, for message authentication code, so the name of the general thing we want to build, and H is for hash-based. So this is a hash-based MAC. And then you specify which hash it is based on. So what hash function you choose here. And now you can pick any secure hash function from the previous table and plug it into this HMAC construction. There is also a different option, and that is using a keyed primitive. So not to add the key on top of an unkeyed thing, but to directly use a keyed building block, like a block cipher. We will see more about that next week when we talk in more detail about block ciphers. But just a brief picture here. One of the most well-known MAC constructions that uses a block cipher, which we denote by EK, is CMAC, where C is for cipher or cipher block chaining. This looks a bit similar as the sponge picture we saw before. And what it does is it has this chaining value as well. It always XORs in the message, applies the keyed function, XORs in the message, and so on until the end. At the end, to be secure, we actually have to add another key. Okay, so these are two construction mechanisms for Mac, and next week we will also see another way to use Macs as a building block of something bigger. But now for the rest of this lecture, let's have a look at how to use this in an actual protocol, particularly in an authentication protocol. So what's the point of an authentication protocol? The goal is what we earlier called entity authentication, also sometimes called identification. So this is now not about protecting data and messages, but about protecting, for example, access control, something like a login, or also as part of communication protocols. So first you make sure who you're talking to, and after that you continue with the normal protocol. So we have two parties involved here. So this is the Alice and Bob of communication protocols. So the first entity is called a prover, P, sometimes also called Peggy. And then there's a verifier who wants some evidence of the prover's claim. And the verifier is sometimes called Victor, which you might remember from the quiz we saw in the beginning. So prover and verifier are the two people we have. Now, I wanted to do a short collection of ideas about what authentication factors we have, but I think we will run out of time for that. So let me just give you the answer. So what is authentication based on? There are three different types of so-called authentication factors. And the first type is something that someone knows. So this could be, for example, a password or a PIN. It can also be something that somebody has or possesses. Like, for example, could be your smartphone. It could be an authentication token, like a FIDO token. Or it could be a smart card that you possess, and so on. So for example, in banking, one of the factors that you have is your banking card. So when you try to withdraw some money from an ATM. And the other thing you have is something you know, namely your PIN. There's this third type, and that is what somebody is. And by this we usually mean biometric properties, such as a fingerprint or a face or your voice. And the last one here is not really considered part of cryptography. So I think I will say a few words about that in the last crypto lecture. But I will focus for the most part on the crypto stuff. So what somebody knows or has. And let's see how we apply these in a simple protocol, namely in a password protocol. So there is a very simple first draft about how you can do this, and I hope that many of you already know that this is not the best way of doing it. So a simple setup could be, we have our two parties here, the prover Alice, who wants to log in, and the verifier B or Victor. And one scheme about how this could do is that every time the user wants to log in, they send both their identity, so their username, so to say, and their key, for example, their password, to the server. And the verifier simply accepts it if this combination of username and key is stored in their database, period. Of course, at some point in the beginning, the prover must have registered with the verifier. This is something that's true for all authentication protocols. In the beginning of everything, at some point they have to agree on what identities the verifier accepts. So what are some problems of this approach? Well, one problem is that every time Alice authenticates, she publishes her entire secret. So if this is here an insecure channel, this sounds like a pretty bad thing to do. So always publish your key and just send it in plain. The other thing is that Bob usually has a stored table of values, and if this leaks, then everything, all keys are written there in plain text, which, since servers are attacked pretty often and such tables also do leak from time to time, is a big problem. And of course there is another problem which is common to all password-based schemes, and that is that the entropy of passwords, so their actual amount of security or their secret bits, is often relatively low. We will revisit this concept of entropy next week when we talk about keys in general. So there are several reasons why this is a bad idea to just do it like that, but there are a few easy things that we can fix to get rid of them. So one of them is to protect the channel by which you transmit the password. So for example, only send your password in case you have already built up a TLS connection to your server. So only send the password on HTTPS sites and not on HTTP sites. So this eliminates the risk of transmitting your password. There is another risk we want to get rid of, namely the stored table of passwords that Bob has. So what the verifier typically does, most servers actually manage to do that, is they don't store the original password, they just store a hash of the password. So if the table leaks, what an adversary sees is only the hashed value. And what they would need to do is they would need to find a pre-image of the hash in order to find a valid password. However, of course, if the password is badly chosen, then finding such a pre-image isn't actually that hard. So this is a general thing to keep in mind about hash functions. Of course, finding pre-images is hard, but if I know that the pre-image can be only one of a small set of values, for example, the message must have been yes or no or maybe, then I can simply try all three values, hash them, and see if the hash matches what I have. So if the entropy of the message is low, then all the super security of a hash function is also not going to rescue you. This only makes sense if the original input has enough entropy. Okay, so storing the hashes is slightly better, but what you still see here, for example, is when two users have used the same password, this will show up in the table because the hash will also be the same. And in particular, an attacker could pre-compute the hashes of many frequently used passwords, so-called rainbow table, and simply look if one of the frequently used passwords shows up in this table here. So this is again bad, and we need to do something again against it, and this something is called salting, which some of you mentioned in the chat earlier. So salting means that the verifier enters not just the user's password into the hash function, but also some additional random value that was generated at one time in the beginning and is stored next to the username. And this salt is a sort of randomizer. So if now two people have hunter2 as a password, they will, however, have different salts. So the hash value will also be different because it depends on the salt. So if you have a bad password, of course, the attacker can still try the password, but now they can't just work with a pre-computed table. And they can also not do easily things like detect duplicates and stuff. So it makes it harder for the attacker, but still not impossible if you have a bad password. There is something else that is not on this slide that people also mention in the chat, and that is the so-called pepper. So what's the difference between salt and pepper? The pepper is also an additional value that goes into the hash function. However, whereas the salt is different for each user, but publicly stored in the database, the pepper is something like an extra key. So it's the same for all users, but it's secret. It's not stored on the server in the same place as the table. So these are protecting against different sorts of attacks. So the pepper is in case the table is leaked, but the attacker does not manage to access the pepper, which is stored separately. In that case, the entire database is sort of encrypted. What are some modern password hash functions to use? So the requirements are a bit different from what we've heard before. In particular, they should usually have an extra input for the salt. Of course, we could just concatenate the salt and the message and put it into a normal hash function. But usually there are things you can do wrong when you do it like that. So it's better to already have a function which accepts a salt and maybe a pepper. It should also be not too fast. And this is to protect against users with weak passwords. Because when is this password hashing function evaluated? Usually when the user logs in, but the user really doesn't notice if it takes something like 10 or 50 milliseconds to process their password. As long as it doesn't take 5 seconds, the user probably won't notice because typing the password already took quite a bit of time. So it's okay if the hash function takes a lot longer than, say, an alias which you want to apply to your whole disk. And if it's slower, then it means it also takes an attacker accordingly longer to test, for example, many passwords. So for the attacker, it makes a lot of difference if he waits a million times 50 milliseconds or if he waits a million times some nanoseconds, for example. And there's an extra thing which has become more important in the past few years, and that is you should also, or it's good if the password function takes a lot of memory to evaluate. This is to protect against things like ASIC attacks where you have dedicated hardware that just does hash evaluations. And this is because memory is more expensive than time. However, the legit user usually has quite a lot of memory. He won't notice if the password hashing function takes a few megabytes of their RAM. That's not noticeable. But in the mass evaluation, if every evaluation takes megabytes of RAM, this is pretty expensive. So here are some popular hashing functions that are considered secure. The first one I already mentioned. You want to come in or not? No. So password-based key derivation function number 2. And there's bcrypt and scrypt, which are a bit older but still okay. And more recently, there was also a public competition for this sort of thing, namely the password hashing competition, which produced promising candidates like Argon 2, which are not yet very widely used. So this is what you are likely to see in some actual systems. If you see something different, in the worst case, if you see a weak hash function from the previous crypto hash function part, be alerted and please tell the people to update. So unfortunately, you still find hundreds of servers who use, for example, MD5, so the hash function which has been broken for 15 years, even for normal use, let alone password use. They are still using that. So if you see that, please tell, either update the server if it's your own or tell the people. In particular, many people who use the default configuration of PHP sessions, for example, they sometimes accidentally use MD5 without noticing. So that's something to check. There are still some problems with these passwords that we haven't really fixed, and that can be fixed with a different type of scheme, namely strong authentication schemes or challenge response protocols. So one of the problems that we haven't solved yet for password-based schemes is that the user always has to transmit the complete secret. And one of the problems of this is, depending on how insecure the channel is, that this could later be used by an attacker in a replay attack. So think, for example, of a scenario like you're not doing a user login, but for example, you're using a car opener, a remote car opener where you click and then your car is opened. And if this would be based on something like the password scheme where you transmit the key every time, then an adversary could simply use some sort of sensor or capturing hardware to capture the signals that are sent from the key, duplicate that and send the same thing next time. So that's an example of a replay attack where you record a message and you play it again at a later point and it's still valid. So this is a problem. And what do we do against it? We should obviously avoid telling the complete secret every time. So what can we do instead is so-called strong authentication protocol or challenge response, where you don't tell your secret, but you prove that you know it. So an example is that the server first sends you some challenge, and then you evaluate a function of this challenge and your secret. And the server who knows your secret can evaluate the same thing and compare. And one example of this is what you saw in the very beginning of the lecture in the Google Authenticator example, where you had to type some digits from your smartphone to log into your website. And the protocol beneath this is the so-called time-based one-time password protocol, TOTP. What this does is, it's usually just one of two factors. So if you use it, you usually have to provide first your password on the website and then the token from your mobile phone. And this token is actually computed as a part of a challenge response protocol, but the challenge is not really sent from the server to your Google Authenticator app. Instead, there's an implicit challenge, which is the current time. So this protocol uses the current timestamp, which is called here TA. And what the phone or what the Google Authenticator app evaluates is it applies a message authentication code, a MAC, to the timestamp, where the key of the MAC is your secret key that both the server and your Google Authenticator app know. And the time is the input, so the output depends on the current time. This requires synced clocks between your smartphone and the server. And the server also evaluates the same MAC for hopefully the same timestamp, and see if the result matches. And this timestamp is something that changes, for example, every 30 seconds or so. And there is some tolerance in it to account for clocks that are not completely in sync. And the number that you type in here is actually simply the first few digits of this MAC output, written as decimal numbers instead of as hex numbers. So you're actually typing an output of a MAC function. And this is the implicit challenge in this challenge response protocol. So if you try to log in with the same key sometime later, it's no longer valid because the time is no longer the same. So for tolerance, yes, the server will try both the current timestamp, for example, and a few timestamps in the future and a few timestamps into the past, but not too much, because if it did too much, it would be time consuming. They have to evaluate many MACs, but MACs are pretty fast. And on the other hand, it would be dangerous because this tolerance, of course, also means how long a particular token remains valid. So you at the same time want to make sure that it can't be repeated, so the tolerance is not so large that an attacker could exploit it. Like if your car transmission thing would be valid for 1 hour, you would still have a problem. Okay. So somebody is discussing the details of how long it takes. Notice that this is the timestamp in 30-second steps. So it only changes every 30 seconds. So if you want to cover, for example, 4 minutes with it, you only need 8 different timestamps. So it's not in 1 second steps. Okay, let me come to the conclusion of what we heard today. So we first talked about message authentication and different schemes for doing that. Without a key, with a key, we will hear a bit more next week. And it's also possible with an asymmetric key. We will hear more about that in 2 weeks. And at the end, we had a look at entity authentication schemes, where you can either do so-called weak authentication, like passwords, where you tell the entire secret, or strong authentication, where you respond to some challenge. For example, a number the server sends you or the current time. Okay, and with that, we are almost not over time, depending on how many questions you still have for me. So we will unfortunately need to jump the message we had here in the beginning. But what I would love to know from you is first, which of the things we did in the lecture do you want to keep? So do you want to keep the break? Do you want to keep the break quiz? And so on. So if you could vote on that now, that would be great. And in the meantime, you can also enter questions, and I will spend the next 5 minutes or so answering the most popular ones. All the questions that are still open, then we can move over to the Discord channel. Sorry, this is the wrong question. This is which authentication factor would you rate strongest? That's of course nice if you vote. It would be great if at the end the USB token ended somewhere further up. But I think I will have to give you only a few more seconds for that before I switch to the question I actually wanted to ask. So yeah, good work on pushing the USB token further up. Whether the fingerprint is this high up depends on whether you ask a biometric person, they will tell you, sure, or whether you ask a cryptographer who will probably tell you, I'm not convinced. Anyway, let's hop to the slide I actually wanted to go to, which is some feedback on what you want to keep for the next lecture. So break, yes or no. Break quiz, yes or no, or how much you like it. These questions in the meantime, and the final Q&A. So it seems like the break quiz is the least popular. It's probably also going to lose its novelty rather soon, once everybody has tried pasting some images into the Google Docs. Okay, let's give it a few more seconds. In the meantime, if you have any feedback on how you prefer to ask your questions and have them answered during the lecture, I'd also be happy for that. But it's better if you send it to me on Discord rather than right here. Okay, so opinions are a bit tight about the break quiz. Most of you do like the break. Most of you do like the questions in between. And you're more or less convinced of the Q&A. Okay, so let's then go on to the Q&A and see which questions you've already sent. So there's a first one here, which was on the file download example in the beginning. So the question here is, is it more secure to use the direct download into the torrent? Well, since we do add the crypto, overall, it should be similar. However, in our example, the website was sort of considered the secure channel because it was already protected by TLS and so on. Whereas the torrent is something that anybody could have posted there. So in that sense, the torrent is by default less secure, but if you make sure to check your checksum at the end, then it's equally good. The recap quiz is really cool. Yeah, okay, then we'll keep that for the next lecture and maybe replace the break quiz by it. Let's give that a go. I'll also see if I can upload the quiz for afterwards so that you can test yourself towards the end of the year, for example, or the term. More Menti questions. Sure, I will do that. How many years do you expect it to take until I have to rework the feasibility slide? The thing is that so far Moore's law has been quite reliable in forcing us to rework this slide every few years, or at least every 20 years or so. So for example, you can see that in the beginning of the 90s, 128-bit hash output, which is 64-bit security, was still considered okay. However, Moore's law is not going to be with us forever. So this will slow down at some point. I guess that I will probably make an update to that in 10 or 15 years or so, but certainly not in the next 3 years, I expect. What is a signature and why can we trust it? Please wait for the lecture in 2 weeks' time. In short, it's a bit like a message authentication code, but only one person can produce the tag, but everybody can verify it. Why would the fingerprint not be secure for a cryptographer? This is because fingerprints have been optimized a lot towards usability, so towards making sure that you are not rejected as often or not too often. So it's relatively tolerant in which fingerprints it accepts. And fingerprints are also something that you can't change and that you carry around with you all the time. So an attacker will possibly find it easier to collect your fingerprint rather than your password. For example, if they just take one of your used glasses out of the dishwasher, they have your fingerprint. And you can change your fingerprint in case something actually gets stolen. And And the other thing is that fingerprint matching requires a lot of image processing that simplifies stuff. So in the end, your fingerprint isn't that unique anymore. So there might be multiple people whose fingerprints will be accepted on your phone, for example. And it's not so easy to scale that up to add more bits of security to that. Isn't Moore's law already breaking? Yeah, maybe a little bit. So I think it's already slowing down a bit, but you may want to discuss that in Daniel's lecture. How will quantum computers change encryption security? For the authentication part that we saw today, not so much. So a very simple rule of thumb is that where the classical generic attacks on hash functions take 2 to the t divided by 2 on a classical computer, on a quantum computer, they take approximately 2 to the power of t divided by 3. So you lose a few bits of security, but not too much. And we're so far away from such a quantum computer that I wouldn't worry. For signatures, on the other hand, I would worry a lot. So there we definitely need a replacement. It would be nice to say right answers to all of the questions that are mentioned. Yeah, I was trying my best to do that. I didn't catch up with all of them because we're already running out of time, but I'll try my best on Discord afterwards, and if there's something you miss, let me know. Would it be feasible to have like an eye scan on phones? I think that's pretty much feasible. I'm not too familiar with the actual technology, like how big it is, how well it integrates with requirements like being resistant to dust and water and stuff. So I'm not an expert on that. I think it could be feasible. I don't know if I would want that, to be honest. The Menti questions are really nice. Okay, I will keep them. Can we have a more privacy-oriented communication channel than Discord? I'm absolutely open for suggestions. I guess one of the things you might not like about Discord is that it typically displays your usual user image that you use there. You can, of course, join with an arbitrary pseudonym. That's a bit more unpractical if you have like a separate private account and account for teaching. So I'm not sure what the best solution there is. Of course, you can always write me an email. You can use any sort of pseudonym on Discord that is not your usual nickname. But if you have a better suggestions, please let me know. There are already phones who have an iris scanner. Thanks for answering that one. Upload the slides previous to the lecture. I usually do that. It seems I forgot today. Sorry about that. Do I have a favorite security method? That's a very general question. I do have some favorite ciphers, but maybe I will talk more about that next week. Do you store your passwords or how do you manage them? I have a password manager. I usually generate fresh passwords or accept the freshly generated passwords for new websites and store them in my password manager. It's not one of those browser integrated things because I don't like that they are typically already unlocked once you unlock your computer. I do prefer to actually have to enter my master password when I want to look up a password. For some crap websites that I never plan to visit again and where I don't have any critical data, I also use just some stupid reused passwords. But for the most part, I generate them randomly. Is the kickoff for P1 later today? Yes, it is. Okay, with that, thanks for your questions. Let's do the rest in Discord or some more privacy-preserving channel, and see you next week. And you will probably see Daniel in the afternoon. Thanks for watching.